honored to be here and to have this opportunity. It's an incredible moment. We're just getting ready to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. Can you imagine that? A translation that has not only been in place for 400 years, that has been the dominant translation in its language for 400 years, that has survived all of the issues that have arisen over 400 years. That's amazing to think about. When writing on it, I chose to call it Majestic Legacy for two reasons. The word majestic carries the idea of royalty. Certainly, this was the Bible that was produced under the direction of royalty. But the influence and impact it's had for 400 years has made it the king of English Bibles. It's been an interesting thing for me. I came along going to Bible college in the early 1970s. Of course, you understand I was a child prodigy. I went when I was only 3. But I went to Bible college in the early 1970s. And it was in a time when the King James Bible was particularly under attack. You heard it all over the place, and I've been hearing it until recently from many angles. We heard the King James Bible belittled. We were told it's an inferior translation. We were told that it was inferior translators. I've even heard in independent Baptist circles that the translators were evil and wicked men. And I mean, we just heard it so often that if you used the King James Bible, you weren't scholarly. You couldn't be blessed. It wasn't going to help you. You couldn't get anywhere. People couldn't understand it. And we've been bombarded with that. But long as I've been aware of being in the ministry, being in Bible college training for the ministry, I've heard that, and I've heard people belittle the King James Bible. I understand it's not been universal, and there are folks who've been very faithful to it. I've seen moments when people were willing to pay great price to be loyal to the King James Bible. I pastor in Chicago, which is sort of the headquarters of the contemporary church movement. We do not ever have anybody saved in our church, but one of their friends or neighbors or co-workers finds out they got saved, and they're going to a church that uses the King James Bible, and somebody tells them, you'll never be able to understand that. Which is interesting because they were always understanding it just fine until somebody told them that. We had one case, we had a precious young lady saved out of Muslim background, and there's quite a story to it to tell for another time, but she got saved out of a Muslim background, and there was a couple of young ladies at our church she was sitting with at every service. So we'd given her a Bible. She'd been coming to church for a few weeks before she got saved, and a few weeks after she got saved. She noticed that folks she sat with had leather reference Bibles. So she went into a Christian bookstore for the first time in her life and just went up and told them she wanted a black leather reference Bible. She knew nothing of versions or kinds or translations. She was used to the Quran. So they sold her a black leather reference Bible. She cheerfully brought it to church the next Sunday morning. And I noticed her as I'm reading along in the scripture. She's looking at it. And she looks puzzled. She looks one side of the front, another side of the front. She told me later she took it back to the bookstore, told them they had sold her a defective Bible, and she wanted one with the right words in it. And somehow they knew. They took the Bible, they sold her back, and they gave her another one, and they gave her a King James Bible after she said that. Somehow they knew what she meant when she said one with the right words in it. But we've been listening to the King James Bible be belittled. And yet all of a sudden, it's like the folks who have focused on that so much have come to a screeching halt. Because now all of a sudden, in the literary world, in the historical world, in the linguistic world, people say, wait a minute. We've got the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible to celebrate. So questions come up. How exactly did this translation last for 400 years? If it was so inferior, how come it's lasted for 400 years? If it's so hard to understand, why all of a sudden are so many people praising it? If it was so insignificant, why has it had such impact? And I've had more than one person tell me over the years, Phil, you'd come across like a scholarly type fella. if you would just give up this King James Bible. That just ruins the image, because you can't come across as a scholarly type guy if you're using the King James Bible. Now all of a sudden, all kinds of secular scholars are praising the King James Bible. And the folks who are so adjusted to criticizing it are a little muted, a little quiet, because the question is being asked from a literary angle, from a historical angle, from a linguistic angle, and I would suggest we ask it from a spiritual angle. Why has this translation lasted and had such impact for 400 years? I'm going to try to answer a little bit of that tonight, and we're going to finish it tomorrow. And we just did that to get you all to come back tomorrow. Okay? Here are just some interesting thoughts. According to Vanderbilt Press, the King James Bible is the best-selling book of all time. According to historian Adam Nicholson, it's the most purchased book ever in the history of the world. And he also said, no, not all these were purchased, many of these have been given away, but it's in 1611, now 399 years, soon to be 400, that there have been 5 billion copies of the King James Bible printed. That's a pretty large number for such an insignificant translation. According to the Nelson Publishing Company, it is the most frequently quoted book in existence in any language. According to a book called The Story of English, which just rehearses the history of the English language, it's the most influential book ever published in the English language. According to Compton's Encyclopedia, it's the most influential book in the history of English civilization. Hey, that doesn't sound like what I've been hearing for the last 30 years. Would you look with me very carefully or quickly to Psalm 138, verse 2? Just read very quickly before we go on with the rest of this. Psalm 138, verse 2, I will worship toward thy holy temple and praise thy name for thy loving kindness and for thy truth, for thou hast magnified thy word above all thy name. God has promised to give an honor and an influence to his word. And I would suggest to you the only way that you can explain the 400 years of influence of the King James Bible is to believe that God has had his hand upon it. I know it's been common to say that scholarly people have turned their back on the King James Bible, but many a person who feels very scholarly has on their library shelf something called the Nicene, Ante-Nicene, Nicene, and Post-Nicene Fathers. Quite a series of books, and it is the writings of folks from the early centuries of Christianity that have been preserved for us today. Those writings have been translated and prepared and packaged, and the editor of all that work was a fellow named Arthur Cleveland Cox. Because of his knowledge in languages and history, just considered one of the most incredibly scholarly men of all time. But he's an interesting man. He wrote, the Holy Scriptures, as translated in the reign of King James I, are the noblest heritage of the Anglo-Saxon race. By the way, I'm wondering if any of the King James Bible's critics could have done the editing work that he did on all these ancient writers. Another little interesting look at what he's written. He addresses the subject of 1 John 5:7, which is the most attacked and criticized verse in the Bible. Long list of people to say that doesn't belong, and I've taken a lot of criticism for having written in defense of the idea it belongs in the Bible. Arthur Cleveland Cox is the one I got this from. He wrote about this and he pointed out, he said the folks that criticize 1 John 5:7 are quick to say it was not quoted by the early writers in the Christian realm. But he said the truth is it's quoted all over the place. He said apparently somebody said that at some point and people began repeating it. People who had never read the early writers. And when this statement was challenged, people began to say, but yes, it's there, it's there, it's there, it's there. They said, well, those are forgeries that were stuck in centuries later. But he said, how do you know that? How do they know they're forgeries? Because they quote 1 John 5:7, which nobody quotes. But how do you know 1 John 5:7 doesn't belong? Because nobody quotes it. And he pointed out that when you offer that circle as scholarship, you're exposing What's wrong with your thinking? Well, King James Bible is extraordinarily famous for its beauty, even in the world of non-believers. C.S. Lewis, writing in the introduction to a modern English translation, says, "The King James Bible was too beautiful to use and read every day." While I'm not sure what that means, I don't recall anybody having ever said it about any other English Bible. H.L. Mencken, the skeptic, said it is probably the most beautiful piece of writing in all the literature of the world. There are several books come out, and more do over the course of the next year, looking at the literary beauty of the King James Bible and its impact. As one author pointed out, without the King James Bible, there'd be no Paradise Lost. Without the King James Bible, there'd be no Handel's Messiah, which the wording of is key to the King James Bible. Without the King James Bible, there'd be no Negro spirituals that are famous for their impact on our heritage. Without the King James Bibles, there'd be none of our classic hymns, which are keyed to the words of the King James Bible. So without the King James Bible, there'd be no Gettysburg Address, which quotes it and uses phrases from it constantly. I was interested to find out that Charlton Heston wrote about the King James Bible in his autobiography. He said during the time they were filming the movie Ten Commandments, he read it a great deal. He talked about the beauty of it. And he said, talking about how the translations that had come along since 1611 are particularly in the last few years designed to replace it. He said when you get around to reading them, he called them the boring recent translations. Now, they're advertised this way. They're so simple to understand. But you want to know why they're so simple to understand? Because they don't say much. I don't know about you, if I read 1,000 pages, I want it to say something. 1,000 pages that's watered down and doesn't say much, he nailed it. Should be called boring. 1977, Ronald Reagan spoke about this. And he was describing the attempt of folks to offer the Good News Bible as a replacement for the King James Bible. And he said he had no doubt about their sincerity, and they were trying to offer the world something that was simpler and more limited and easier to understand. He said no doubt that they were sincere about wanting to do a good deed. But he said, doesn't it make more sense to bring people up to the level of the King James Bible than provide something that's down to the level that they're at? A lot is being said right now, and has been said throughout the last 400 years, about the linguistic influence of the King James Bible. I confess this was news to me when I began to study for this particular presentation. A great deal has been written, and there's a great deal of focus again upon it, about the influence of the King James Bible on the English language. The English language was called by someone the tributary, the ocean from which all tributaries flow into, because we have words from so many different languages. Before the Bible in English, most English writing was in Latin, and it reflected the Latin way of writing things. And the King James Bible, the process involved in it, starting with William Tyndale. And when you read your King James Bible, it's about 80% the wording of William Tyndale. Starting with Tyndale, and even more so when you get to the King James Bible, they wrote using Anglo-Saxon words in the English language rather than the Latin words that came over in English language. There's a reason for that. Latin takes a long time to say anything. Anglo-Saxon is quick, direct, and to the point. Okay? If you tried to say, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap," it takes a page in Latin. If you've ever seen any of the old Latin Bibles, they're considerably larger. But you can say that in 4 brief sentences in English. Try writing "For God so loved the world" in Latin. If you want to get an idea how involved Latin is, the legal language that our laws are written in is primarily Latin terminology brought over into the English. Have you ever tried to read and understand the legalese that exist today? And you'll read it, and it'll take a page, and you say, why couldn't you have said that in 5 or 6 words? Well, I frankly believe there's a reason why our legislators use that kind of language. They want to produce laws that no one but them understands. And they do it on purpose. But to do it, they have to go to Latin words that came into English, because the Anglo-Saxons said it quickly, directly, succinctly. And the King James Bible became the first major English book primarily using Anglo-Saxon words. People used words to describe it like it's simple, it's direct, it's clear, it's clean. Matthew Arnold, who is a famous writer, said if you want to find perfect plainness of speech, read the King James Bible. Now, interestingly enough, this doesn't stop with the King James Bible. The King James Bible became such an influence on England, it transformed the English language that you got to the place where that is the way English people spoke day to day, and that for a long time all successful literature in the English world had to be written in the style of the King James Bible if you were going to get a large number of people to look at it. So you find that style in things like the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution. Isn't it amazing? We could produce the United States Constitution in less than a dozen pages, and the health care bill ran 2,800 pages, and absolutely no one knew what it said when it was done. But we got the entire Constitution in a dozen pages, and the Declaration of Independence in less than that. That is the influence of the King James Bible on English. That is the influence of the King James Bible on the way that the English people would think, on the way that American people think. And yet to this day, if we hear someone reading the legal language of a bill or a court document, we just shake our heads. We're not going to take the time to listen to all that and understand it. We think in a certain way in the English-speaking world, and I'll admit we're starting to fade away from that, but we think in a certain way, we read in a certain way, and if you want to write something that people read, it's written in a certain way, and that is a thought process that we got from the King James Bible. You ever wondered why in other countries, when in another language, a politician gets up to make speeches and they'll take 4 or 5 hours for a political speech? It's because of all the words they're using to say that. You do know what people do in the United States if somebody tries to talk for 4 or 5 hours. Okay? I was asked to preach one time in the Philippines for 5 hours. Let me say this up front. If that's what you really want, I am the man for the job. Okay? But I took 6 sermons, one on each of the Baptist distinctives that I would preach in the United States, and I spun them all together in one sermon, because I'm going to tell you this, nobody's ever wanted me to speak for 5 hours in the United States. We don't do things that way. I will never forget the ladies' trio from the Bible college I was associated with went to the Philippines, and they were singing in that meeting, and they were sitting there on the front row when the preacher announced that I'd agreed to preach for 5 hours, and they were laughing and joking because they thought he was laughing and joking. I will never forget the look on their face when they realized he was serious. Everybody else was sort of excited. I must say they weren't. I was asked in the Philippines one time to preach for 3 hours because they had several local dignitaries married and so forth there, and so they wanted to make sure they had a long sermon for them. No one's ever asked me, given me a similar request here in the States, Brother Levesque. But you know one reason in the United States we want to hear plain speaking, straight, clear, to the point. Our entire language and culture was formed around speaking that way, but that was not the truth before the King James Bible. Try to read anything that came in English literature before the King James Bible. The King James Bible gave us that, and it changed the way people think. And connected with this, the King James Bible was produced to be read and understood by the average person. Now, today, the average person has to learn a few old English words in order to do that. It's not nearly as hard as you think. In fact, most people don't know there's a problem with it till you tell them. But before the King James Bible, books were written by scholars for scholars. Didn't matter that most people were illiterate because you weren't producing anything you wanted them to read anyway. The King James Bible was produced to be read by the average person in England, and it changed the whole realm of education. When all of a sudden there was a book there that read the way that at that time people could understand and speak, and so as long as they knew how to read, they could read the Bible. It transformed English society because it made the Bible a household book. Not only that, the influence of King James himself. See, before the English Bible, before the King James Bible, there was a great debate in England as to whether or not the common people should be allowed to read the Bible. And the early English translations were outlawed, and people gave their lives for having a Bible. And people were thrilled as a result. Bibles were rare, and people were thrilled if they had a few pages of the Bible. If you get one of those actual pages of a King James Bible, you'll put it in a frame and hang it in your home. You won't read it every day. But before the King James Bible, there were people who would have been thrilled to have owned one page of the Bible. And they'd have read it every day, after day, after day. Even some of the early English versions that were openly allowed by the king, there was always a local bishop or a local sheriff or a local abbot to persecute people for having the King James Bible in their home. Something happened when the king sponsored an English Bible. Now, all of a sudden, there was not a sheriff anywhere brave enough to prosecute you for owning a Bible sponsored by the king. There was not a bishop, and there might have been bishops that regretted the fact that people had the Bible, but there was not a bishop anywhere brave enough to persecute you because you had a Bible sponsored by the king. You might have lived on church land supervised by an abbot, but there was not an abbot in England brave enough to fine you for having a Bible sponsored by the king. King James, and by the way, I'm convinced he did this consciously and purposely, King James politically, and the King James translators, with the translation that they made the Bible a household item in England. Imagine the difference that made in a culture where very, very few people ever saw a Bible for themselves. The only thing they knew about the Bible was what priests had told them was in it. And when through some fortunate moment they could obtain a few pages of it, they were thrilled with that. But how would you like to have just a few pages of your Bible to try and figure out all of what God was saying to you from? How'd you like it if you had a few pages of Job and you were trying to discern all of God's will? Or a few pages of Revelation and you were trying to figure out what the polity for the local church should be? Or a few pages of describing the battles recounted in 1st and 2nd Kings, and you were trying to build a church off of it. Imagine loving the Lord with all your heart, and yet only having bits and pieces and scraps of His truth in front of you. You ever go back and study those times and how horrid life was? And there was recently a big Major Dunn TV special, and it was horrible to watch. I couldn't take but pieces of it because it fairly accurately portrayed how horrible day-to-day life was back in the 1100s and 1200s in England. And it was historically accurate. But frankly, I didn't want to watch anything that was historically accurate from that era. But you know how it changed life? When the average, normal home had a Bible from Genesis to Revelation. It was not hidden to be brought out in rare moments. It was open. They could take it with them. They could read it to their family. They did not have to fear their children would be persecuted for having their own Bible. And they could study and read and look at the Bible for themselves and find everything that God wanted them to know. How do you think that transformed a society? How do you think that changed things? Alistair McGrath wrote about the King James Bible, says it didn't follow literary trends. It established them. It didn't copy figures of speech. It gave figures of speech to the English language. It did not copy some Greek or Roman writer as how to say things, but established a style of direct expression that England copied. It was written to the common man. But more than that, do you understand how evil rulers always depend on a brainwashed people to carry out their schemes and their plans? You can't steal from the people by telling them, I'm here to steal from you. You cannot take away the freedoms of a people who understand what's happening. People depend, rulers, dictators, malevolent kings, depend on a brainwashed people who do not know what's going on around them, who do not have discernment, who cannot ask questions, who cannot see the end result of things. That is why around the world to this day, dictators and tyrants, no matter what religious perspective they're from or from no religious perspective, do not want people to own Bibles. You can't brainwash people that have their own Bibles. You want to know why the English-speaking world develops so differently than the rest of the world? People today, and there's so much of this, Brother Levesque referred to it in the last hour. There's recently been a major book released describing the attitude of our own president and a resentment of what we would call English or British or American culture, Western civilization. He has at times been outrageously rude to the English government, people, and the monarchy there. He just reflects what's established in liberal centers. And by the way, I pastor in Chicago. I've met one or two liberals there. And the world has looked at this and said, how did the English-speaking world, England, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, how is it that those people have so much of this world's goods? They said there has to be an explanation. And so the explanation of those who hate the Christianity that produced these cultures, have said, we know they stole it from the rest of the world. And so they resent what they consider the theft of their wealth the same way you would if your neighbors had taken your house and your property from you. And that's been drummed into them, that the English-speaking cultures of the world are wealthy because they robbed the other cultures of the world. But that is not primarily what happened. When you find an isolated example here or there of a prominent person from English-speaking culture or a nation acting in an improper way and stealing, I'm not going to say it never happened, but that is not the source of the great wealth, power, and influence of the English-speaking world. The source is the freedom that people had to produce for themselves, and by making themselves wealthy, they weren't stealing wealth from the people around them. They were making wealth possible for the people around them. And so why did that happen in the English-speaking world to a degree that it happened nowhere else? It's not because the English-speaking people were racially superior. It's because they had freedom. You want to know why the English heritage of freedom developed so fully? That when the English government would stray from the very heritage it once stood for, colonies clear across the ocean would say, you're not going to do that to us. You want to know why the English heritage of freedom developed? Because the English people had a Bible in their home, and their leaders could not tell them what to think about everything. Their leaders could not tell them what God said. Their leaders could not pawn off ridiculous excuses for committing the acts of a tyrant against them. That's because they knew what God said. It was in their home. They could read it for themselves. It influenced the way they think. It caused them to see, to understand. By the way, can I suggest to you that our freedoms are threatened like never before since we've been a republic in this country? And the reason they are threatened is because so many people have not read the Bible. They are not familiar with what it says. And would-be tyrants can get them to believe almost anything. Just for example, back in 1988, we were told that global warming would incinerate the world within 10 years unless we abandoned our industrial culture and surrendered our freedoms. Every year since 1988, we've heard that same speech. We have 10 years left unless we surrender our prosperous economy and abandon our freedoms. But have you noticed we've been hearing how we only have 10 years left for 22 years? Does that bother anyone? Did you understand there are a group of people in this country who simply believe that and accept that because prominent people told them so? Those are the same people who in jungle tribes believed whatever the witch doctor told them. And you know why witch doctors routinely were the greatest opponents of missionaries who came and taught the people to read and translated the Bible into their language and gave them Bibles? The reason witch doctors didn't like that is because once you could read the Bible for yourself and had one on your own, you had no need for a witch doctor. The fact that the English people had a Bible in their home, no one could take it away from them because the king sponsored it. No one could find them. No one could persecute them. No one could put them in prison because the king sponsored it. And they had one they could read and understand using the words that they spoke on a regular basis. They did not have to master the Latin language and spend hours producing something that could be said in 2 or 3 minutes. It transformed a nation. It produced a heritage of freedom. It produced a concept of living. It created a Christian doctrine of government. You read the Declaration of Independence. I know all the foolishness that's out there. People say it was a deistic document. It was anti-Christian. Read it again. They say we have 2 sources of authority. The law of nature. The law of nature is God. If you'll read their writings by law of nature, they meant history and science, what we can observe going on around us. Okay? We get this. Study history. Give a government or a ruler unlimited power, and he will act like a tyrant and steal your freedom and your prosperity. It's not that that happens sometimes. It happens every time. Law of nature, we got it. But if the law of nature is history and science, have you ever asked yourself what the law of nature's God was? It was a common phrase of the time for the Scriptures. So, where did they get that from? They all had Bibles. Are you all ready? You cannot brainwash people who have their own Bibles accurately translated and who read them for themselves. Can't brainwash them. You want to know why there's such a division in our country, where roughly half our country is clamoring for tyranny to protect them from a bad economy, and they don't even know that tyranny always gives you a worse economy? They're clamoring for a tyranny to protect them from problems that don't exist. 1988, when they first began to talk about global warming, we're all going to die in 10 years. And if you remember, but the actor Ted Danson produced a commercial that was being played all over the place in 1988. We have 10 years or we're all dead. And I said I didn't believe that. People said, well, how can you not believe that? I said, I don't believe in global warming. They'd say, how can you not believe in global warming? Well, I said, well, first of all, I'd have to see some evidence of it. And they said, what kind of evidence would satisfy you, a global warming? I said, the earth would have to be getting warmer. That's the evidence that would satisfy me. I got laughed at by a lot of folks. It's just come out within the last year that all the studies that far back were faked. You don't have to be a genius to figure that out. All the weather patterns we're experiencing are the same weather patterns that we've been experiencing since beginning of recorded history. Say, but how come all the people in prominent positions of authority tell us the world is getting warmer? Because they need for us to believe that. I never believed that global warming would destroy our planet. So how can you be so sure? You're certainly not a scientist, and that's true. I already know how it ends. Okay. And frankly, it does end up pretty warm before it's all over. But it's not because people have factories and drive cars. I already know how it ends. You can't get me to buy that. I have a Bible. You can't ask me to surrender my liberty to protect the world from something that doesn't exist. I have a Bible. You can't ask me to trust a government to answer all of my problems because I have a Bible. You can't convince me we need government agents to tell us how to raise children. In a program designed by a woman who was never married and never had any children. So why not? Because I know what the Bible says about raising children. You can't brainwash a Bible-reading people. And it was the King James Bible. The one that so many preachers belittle. The one that so many seminary professors mock. The one that we have been told we had marked ourselves as foolish and unreliable because we believed in it. It was that Bible that gave us all the freedoms that we enjoy. That Bible gave us the freedoms that we enjoy. The freedoms that we enjoy gave us the prosperity that we enjoy. And the men who mock the King James Bible sit in air-conditioned offices to do so. And most of the world wonders how they can have air conditioning. And it's the influence of the Bible they mocked and belittled. We've got such an opportunity. I have much more to say. I hope you'll be here tomorrow and give me a chance to say it. We have such an opportunity because the world has been forced to stop and ask this question. How did this Bible that folks have been so busy belittling? You know, most contemporary churches, they're trained in their literature to put out in their advertisements that they don't use the King James Bible. 200 English Bibles in print, and they mention one they don't use. Yeah, I pastor in the shadow of it. I hear it all the time. We had an Indian family coming to our church. They asked several families related. It was about 20 people. And they asked if Cindy and I would come out and have dinner with them. And they wanted to talk to me. They were considering joining our church. But they said, look, Pastor Stringer, we have to tell you, we like this about the church, we like this, this, and this, but we have one problem. He said, use the King James Bible. And we don't believe our children will ever be able to understand that Bible, and we think they'll lose interest in spiritual things growing up in a church with a Bible they can't understand. And I was going to try to answer that when the person who said that's 9-year-old daughter spoke up. She said, but Dad, I've learned more about the Bible in the last few weeks that we've been attending Ravenswood than I did in the last 2 years in the church we were in before that. I love her. And so I just let her answer it. 400 years. Explain it. Explain why translations come and go. And in the publishing world, a translation that you can make money off of for 20 years is considered a very valuable translation. Explain to me how this one has lasted for 400 years. We have an opportunity to force again a study of this whole subject. We have an opportunity to demand it. That is why, from the moment these dear brethren told me about the plan sponsored by this church, to use this year to call attention to the King James Bible. They were asking me to get on board, but they didn't get a chance to finish asking me because I jumped on board with both feet and everything that I have. This is our moment. This is our moment to demand that the critics come to grips with the truth and that they answer this question for us. How did it last for 400 years? How did it have so much impact? How did it have so much influence? It's time for everybody to face that and to us to sort of gently and pleasantly nudge them along. Explain to me, and that's what I'll try to do tomorrow. How did it last? Why did it last? for 400 years in the way that God has used it. God bless y'all.